That is why they are so fervent. TV with your host, Jeff Charles.
Jeff Charles, contributor for LibertyNation.com.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Right On, where we tackle the issues of the day from the right perspective. Now, misinformation and disinformation is all the rage these days as more information is revealed about governments disseminating propaganda on social media platforms. But are Western governments starting to become the very thing they say they hate? I have with me Liberty Nation's chief political correspondent, Graham Noble, to hash this whole thing out. Welcome to the program, Mr. Noble.
Jeff, good to be here.
Awesome. Now, you recently wrote an article on LibertyNation.com discussing how Western governments are fighting propaganda with more propaganda. You wrote about an interview between the Director of National Intelligence for the United States and also a spy chief for the UK. Can you give us kind of the thumbnail sketch of what you were writing about there?
Sure, Jeff. Well, what it was, there's a program on the UK's BBC, BBC4, and I believe the show is just called Today. And very recently, and I say very recently, this was actually just at the end of last year, sometime in December of last year, Sir Jeremy Fleming, who is the head of Britain's GCHQ, and basically GCHQ is like that's like the British version of the NSA, Government Communications Headquarters, they call it, which is, I love those, you know, in the intelligence community world and the world of, you know, military special operations. They give all these different entities very kind of like vague sounding names. And of course, why not? You know, because they don't really want everyone to know what they actually do. So I don't have a bone to pick with my fellow countrymen over the name of their spy agency. But anyway, so Jeremy Fleming agrees to basically be a guest editor for this BBC Radio 4 show. And as one of the segments on the episode that he was guest editing, he decided to interview Avril Haines, who is, of course, the America's Director of National Intelligence. And they mostly they were talking about basically the Russia's propaganda efforts in its attempts to kind of justify its military aggression in Ukraine, and to kind of paint itself as being the good guys and the Ukrainians as being the bad guys. And of course, you know, there's different opinions on that. But I won't go into that. But certainly, you know, I will make the point that I'm not exactly sympathetic towards the Russians in this particular case of this war. But anyway, so they're talking about that, but they got onto the subject of how to fight propaganda from, or misinformation, if you like, from, you know, our foreign adversaries. And what struck me is that essentially what they were accusing these foreign adversaries of doing is the same as what they want to do in order to counteract those disinformation measures. And so I think it was, you know, so the whole concept to me, it was like, I said at one point in the article, you know, in order to defeat the fascists, we must become fascists. And I thought, well, you know, the way you defeat propaganda is simply by telling people the truth and presenting the facts to them, not by trying to, you know, drive the narrative or the opinion in one particular direction.
So, and we're going to get to the F word, the fascist thing in a second. But in one part of your article, you wrote, quote, "What is troubling about the exchange between these two spy chiefs from supposedly free countries is the idea that the public must be manipulated in order to prevent it from being manipulated by adversaries." Now, but just to, you know, I'm not one to defend the state normally, but just to play devil's advocate, can we really call it manipulation on the part of Western governments if they're giving factual information?
No, you're correct. It's a worthwhile question to ask, and no, I would actually agree, Jeff, that if the government is providing people with the facts, then that's not propaganda. That's not manipulating people. Just telling them the truth of what is going on is not manipulation. But of course, the problem is there's another side to the whole, I use the word propaganda, but really we're talking about just simply manipulating people's perspective. And the thing is, you can do that just as accurately by keeping certain facts from people as you can by presenting, a certain side of the story. I guess one example, I don't really want to go heavily into the subject of the pandemic. But I will say that, and of course we still unfortunately always have to tread carefully when we're talking about that subject, because even today, you can find yourself getting, ridiculed or discredited or even, blocked from certain social media platforms by bringing up certain aspects about how the pandemic was handled that the powers that be don't like. But a good example, the pandemic was a great example, because we were being told certain things about the virus and about the vaccines and all of that kind of stuff. And okay, it's not a matter of whether or not we were being lied to, but what was happening is that certain other information, and some information that was actually coming from reputable medical professionals, was not being allowed. It was being filtered out because it didn't go along with the accepted narrative. So, so what struck me mainly about this interview was that Avril Haines actually said, and I'm quoting her here, authoritarian states have this kind of asymmetrical advantage where they're effectively controlling information to their populations. Now, I thought that was funny that Avril Haines said that, and she's absolutely right. I agree with every word of that statement. But then again, as we know now from the Twitter files, is federal government officials and certain other people, certain corporate CEOs, were in fact doing the same thing. They were attempting to control the information that was going to the civilian population.
Yeah, and when I read that, I'm like, the implication is, too bad we can't do that, but we can, as it turns out, when it comes to what was released in the Twitter files. And I think you touched on a strong point there, because what I always tell people is that when the government is trying to deceive you, or when the media is trying to deceive you, they don't normally make stuff up. They just keep certain information away from you that goes against the narrative, and that's how they get you to believe what they want you to believe. It's easier to tell the truth, but just not all of it, right? So
yeah, sure. I mean, it's basically like if the government told you pears are green and bananas are yellow, well, that's all well and good. They tell you it would be much better if they just showed you some pears and bananas and allowed you to decide for yourself what colors they were. But what about if the government says apples are green, but then somebody comes up and says, well, I actually own a grocery store, and I can tell you that not all apples are green. Some of them are red. And then the government says, oh no, you can't say that. Quick, restrict his social media accounts. He's telling people that some apples are red. So it's that, bit of a funny example, but that's, it's not lying to people, but it's that filtering out of certain facts to create a preferred narrative.
Yeah. Now, you also make a very strong point, getting back to the F word, when you say that Fleming and Haines are intimating that that the United States or Western governments have to become fascist to defeat the fascists. Can you kind of delve a little bit deeper on that? What do you mean by that?
Well, of course, it's a very loaded word. When you start calling people fascists, and of course, people on the left love to do this all the time, which I find very ironic. But so so these days you hear people calling each other fascists, and it seems like a very loaded word. But if we actually go back to the original and correct definition of how fascist regimes actually work, the hallmark, fascism is a collectivist ideology, just like communism and other forms of socialism. But the difference with fascism is that the unique characteristic of fascism is that the regime, the political leaders, the government actually pretty much coerces the private sector, private industry, private corporations, coerces them into working pretty much in partnership with the regime to promote certain political and economic ideas. And that is originally what fascism was. That distinguished fascism from other forms of governments, is that specific thing. So when you've got Haines and her British counterpart talking about, we need to, for instance, Sir Jeremy Fleming said, it can't be just government and intelligence voices out there. They've got to be other voices. And basically what he was saying is that, the like social media companies and tech companies, he's basically almost saying that, they have a duty to promote the government's narrative and therefore lend credibility to it. Because he was acknowledging that, people, if it's just coming from the government, then there's a lot of people not going to trust it. But, if Microsoft and Twitter and all the rest of these companies, Facebook, if they're also kind of promoting the same narrative, then people are likely to believe them. But that basically is it's fascism light. It's kind of a form of fascism, because you've got the government and private industry working hand in hand to promote a common narrative. And that is it's like I said, that is essentially a form of fascism.
Yeah, it's a diet fascism, if you will.
Right. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Zero calorie fascism. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. But yeah, I think that kind of sums up what we're dealing with here. But the thing is, we'll probably be talking about this more as time goes on, because we're going to see more of this come up, especially with the Twitter files. They're not done yet. So, I'm sure as time goes on, we will be back here talking about this very thing and other revelations. But until then, thank you very much for joining the program.
My pleasure, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
And remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news and analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Just go to LibertyNation.com on your browser, or hit Rumble, YouTube, or check out our Liberty Nation News Roku channel. I'm Jeff Charles. Thank you so much for watching. This program is a production of LibertyNation.com, where truth is making a comeback.
Entertaining, informative, and just plain fun. Watch Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5. Produced by conservatives for conservatives. C5's The Left Free Zone. Hosted by Liberty Nation's Lisa K. Donner. Joined by a raucous, irreverent panel of authors. Deconstructing leftist narratives. Debating the hot topics. And remembering to laugh. Join the official conservative safe space.
You only did that to piss Jeff off.
Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5.
That is why they are so fervent. TV with your host, Jeff Charles.
Jeff Charles, contributor for LibertyNation.com.